$65 billion. That was the number printed on the statements. $65 billion spread across thousands of accounts belonging to charities, pension funds, Nobel laureates, and ordinary retirees who believed their life savings were safe. There was just one problem. Almost none of it was real. It had never been real. For decades, it was the most trusted name on Wall Street. And the whole thing was a lie. His name was Bernard Madoff. To the people who handed him their money, he was not a salesman. He was an institution, a former chairman of the Nasdaq stock market, a pioneer of electronic trading, a man so respected that getting into his fund felt like being admitted to a private club. He never promised the moon. He promised something far more seductive, steady, quiet, almost boring returns, year after year, in good markets and bad. And for nearly 30 years, the money kept pouring in. Imagine you are 75 years old. You did everything right. You saved for 50 years and handed it to the safest name you knew. Every few months, a statement arrived, showing your money growing, calm, and certain. And then one ordinary morning, you turn on the television and learn that the statements were fiction. The account was empty, and the money has been gone for years. That morning came all at once for tens of thousands of families around the world. Then, in December of 2008, with the world economy already in free fall, the institution cracked. The investors all wanted their money back at once, and the most trusted man on Wall Street finally had to admit, first to his sons and then to the FBI, that every account, every statement, every steady return had been one enormous fraud. The largest Ponzi scheme in human history. This is the story of how he built it, how he hid it in plain sight for decades, and how many people tried to warn the world and were ignored. To understand the fraud, you first have to understand how completely real the man once was. Bernard Madoff was born in Queens, New York in 1938, the son of working-class parents. He was not from money, and he was not from Wall Street. In 1960, at the age of 22, he founded a tiny brokerage with $5,000 he had saved from summer jobs as a lifeguard and installing sprinkler systems. He called it Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities. One day, it would occupy 3 floors of a Manhattan skyscraper. And here is the part most people forget. For decades, much of Madoff's business was not only legitimate, it was genuinely innovative. While the old guard traded stocks by shouting on exchange floors, Madoff bet early on computers. His firm became one of the largest market makers in the country, matching buyers and sellers electronically and helping to pioneer the technology that would become the Nasdaq, the first major electronic stock market. He served 3 separate times as its chairman. He sat on industry committees. He was, by every measure, a Wall Street insider's insider. But there were, in truth, 2 Bernard Madoffs. Upstairs on the 18th and 19th floors of the Lipstick Building on 3rd Avenue, the legitimate trading business hummed along in full view. Downstairs on the 17th floor, behind a locked door that almost no one was allowed to enter, sat a second secret business, the investment advisory arm. This was the part that managed money for outside clients. This was the part that produced those famous, impossibly steady returns. And this was the part that for years on end traded absolutely nothing at all. The pitch was a masterpiece of psychology. Madoff did not chase investors. He turned them away. Getting in was made to feel like a privilege, something whispered about at country clubs and charity galas, from Palm Beach to Geneva. He claimed to use a strategy called a split strike conversion, buying a basket of blue-chip stocks while using options to cushion against losses. It sounded sophisticated, it sounded safe, and the results seemed to speak for themselves. 10 to 12% a year, like clockwork, almost never a losing month. Much of Madoff's money came from people who trusted him because he was one of their own. He raised it inside tight communities, religious congregations, charities, country club circles, where a personal recommendation from a respected friend was worth more than any audit. Investigators have a name for this. They call it affinity fraud, when a con artist exploits the bonds of a shared community so that doubting the scheme feels like doubting your neighbors. The closer the circle, the less anyone wanted to be the one to ask hard questions. And those returns became the stuff of legend. While the market lurched up and down, Madoff's clients watched their statements climb in a calm, unbroken line, barely flinching even in years when everyone else was bleeding. To the people receiving them, that smoothness was not a warning. It was proof of genius, proof that Bernie had cracked some private code the rest of Wall Street could not. The mystique fed on itself. The harder it was to get in, the more everyone wanted in. It was, above all, a family firm. Madoff's wife, Ruth, had worked alongside him in the early years. His brother Peter helped run compliance. His two sons, Mark and Andrew, built careers on the legitimate trading floor upstairs. To the outside world, the Madoffs looked like the wholesome embodiment of the American dream. A self-made man who had built an empire and surrounded himself with the people he loved. Almost none of them, investigators later concluded, knew what was really happening behind the locked door downstairs. But that smoothness was exactly the problem for anyone willing to look. Real investing is not smooth. Markets breathe. The greatest investors in the world have losing years. Madoff seemed to have almost none. Picture $100 growing year after year, never stumbling, never falling back. To the trusting, that line was a miracle. To a handful of people who understood the math, that line was something else entirely. It was impossible. So, how do you fake a fortune for almost 30 years? The answer is older than Wall Street itself, and it carries the name of a man who became famous for it a century ago. It is called a Ponzi scheme, named for Charles Ponzi, who ran a notorious version of it in the 1920s. The mechanics are brutally simple. You promise investors big, reliable returns. When the first investors want to be paid, you do not pay them from profits, because there are no profits. You pay them with the money handed to you by the next investors. And to pay those, you need more after them, and more after that. A Ponzi scheme is not an investment. It is a line that must never stop growing. The moment more money asks to leave than is coming in, the whole structure collapses in an instant. Madoff's version ran out of that locked 17th floor. There were no real trades. Client money flowed into a single ordinary bank account and largely just sat there or flowed back out to whoever was cashing in. The famous statements, the ones showing all those perfectly timed stock purchases, were pure fiction, generated after the fact on an old IBM computer, so the prices always matched what the market had already done. A small, fiercely loyal staff kept the illusion running, led by his lieutenant, Frank de Pascali, fabricating decades of trades that never happened. When a major client or a rare auditor wanted proof, the team would spring into action, backdating trades, even chilling freshly printed statements in a refrigerator so the paper would look aged, and rehearsing answers in advance. The fabrication was meticulous, almost artistic. Entire decades of market history were quietly reverse-engineered into documents that looked flawless. It was not one big lie told once. It was thousands of small, careful lies told every single day, for years, without a crack. And here was perhaps the most absurd detail of all. The firm that supposedly audited Madoff's multi-billion-dollar empire was a tiny shop in a strip mall north of New York City, with one active accountant working out of a single room. No serious institution audits billions of dollars through a one-man operation. It was a red flag the size of a billboard. Yet the banks, the feeder funds, and the regulators who could have asked the obvious question almost never did. But Madoff could not gather tens of billions of dollars, one handshake at a time. The real fuel came from feeder funds, outside investment funds that pooled their clients' money and shoveled it wholesale into Madoff. The largest, Fairfield Greenwich, funneled in billions. Others followed, from Tremont to the funds run by financier Ezra Merkin, who quietly steered more than $2 billion of other people's money to Madoff while collecting handsome fees. These funds were paid to ask hard questions. Many of them simply collected their cut and looked away. Through those funds, Madoff's reach went global. Some of the biggest banks in Europe and the wealthiest families in the world ended up exposed, often without their clients ever knowing the name Madoff at all. Money came from Spain, from Switzerland, from the Gulf, from Asia, all of it pooled and passed up the chain until it landed in that one quiet account in Manhattan. It was a machine for converting trust anywhere on Earth into a number on a fabricated page, and so the numbers swelled into something almost cartoonish. By the end, the account statements claimed roughly $65 billion under management, scattered across about 4,800 accounts. Madoff had clients on 6 continents: universities, hospitals, banks, and ordinary families, all of them certain their money was parked safely with the steadiest hand on Wall Street. None of them knew they were holding pieces of the same beautiful, empty illusion. Here is the hardest part of the whole story to accept. This was not a secret that could not be cracked. One man cracked it, almost completely, nearly a decade before the collapse. And then he spent years screaming into the void. His name was Harry Markopolos, a financial analyst in Boston with a head for numbers and a near-obsessive eye for fraud. In 1999, his own firm asked him to reverse engineer Madoff's strategy and build a product that could match it. He sat down with the numbers, and within hours, he later said he knew. The returns were mathematically impossible. The smooth, rising line Madoff produced could not come from the strategy he described. There was only one explanation that fit all the evidence. It was a fraud. The deeper Markopolos dug, the worse it looked. Madoff claimed to be hedging his giant fund using options, but the entire market for those options was far too small to cover a fund his size. The trades he described, at the volumes he implied, would have been visible to everyone, and no one on Wall Street could see them, because they were not happening. It was as if someone claimed to fill an ocean using a garden hose. The numbers did not bend. They simply could not be true. Markopolos did what any honest person would do. He took it to the regulators. In 2000, he handed the Securities and Exchange Commission his analysis. Nothing happened. He went back in 2001. Nothing. In 2005, he submitted a detailed memo with a title that left nothing to the imagination. The world's largest hedge fund is a fraud. He laid out roughly 24 red flags. He practically drew them a map. And still, the agency whose entire job was to catch this investigated briefly, missed it, and moved on. He grew so afraid of what he had found that he feared for his own safety. And Markopolos was not entirely alone. As early as 2001, a reporter at Barron's and a trade publication openly questioned how Madoff could possibly generate such consistent results, noting that rivals who tried to copy the strategy simply could not reproduce it. Quietly, some sophisticated due diligence firms studied Madoff and refused to invest, unable to make the numbers work. The doubts were out there, in print, for anyone to read. But doubt is not the same as proof. And Madoff's reputation was a fortress. How could the watchdog miss it? Over and over. Part of the answer is the same reason everyone missed it. When a man has been chairman of the Nasdaq, when his name opens every door in finance, when he is a pillar of the establishment, the instinct is to assume he must be clean. The investigators who looked into Madoff asked a few questions, accepted reassuring answers, and walked away. His greatest weapon was never a clever trade. It was respectability. Why did so many look away for so long? Part of it was greed. As long as the steady checks kept clearing, why ask a question that might end the gravy train? Part of it was trust. Surely a man this respected could not be a crook. And part of it was something deeper and more human. People did not want it to be a lie, because if it were a lie, then they had been fools. Fraud on this scale does not survive on cleverness alone. It survives on everyone's quiet wish not to look too closely. Every Ponzi scheme has the same fatal weakness. It can survive almost anything, except the day too many people want their money back at once. For Bernie Madoff, that day arrived with the financial crisis of 2008. In the autumn of 2008, the global economy was coming apart. Lehman Brothers had collapsed. Banks were failing. Markets were in panic. And all over the world, Madoff's investors, desperate to cover losses everywhere else, began doing the one thing his scheme could not survive. They asked for their money back. By December, redemption requests had piled up to around $7 billion, but the account meant to hold $65 billion held only a tiny fraction of that. The line had finally stopped growing. The math had finally caught up. In those final weeks, the mask began to slip. Madoff scrambled for cash, leaning on the last loyal investors he could find, even as he quietly prepared to hand out what little remained. He told colleagues he was planning to pay out employee bonuses early. Behind the calm face he had worn for decades, he knew the end had come. There was no trade left to make, no new investor large enough to plug a $7 billion hole. The most successful con in history had finally run out of road. On the 10th of December 2008, Madoff called his two sons, Mark and Andrew, into his apartment. Both worked on the legitimate side of the firm. He told them the truth that thousands of investors still did not know, that the investment advisory business was, in his own words, one big lie, that it had been insolvent for years, that the money was gone. He said he had perhaps a few $100 million left and meant to hand it to family and employees before turning himself in. His sons were stunned. They had grown up worshipping their father, built their careers in his shadow, and now learned that the family name was attached to the largest fraud anyone had ever seen. And then they did the thing that would define and ultimately haunt the rest of their lives. They walked out, called a lawyer, and reported their own father to the federal authorities. By the next morning, the FBI was on its way. On the morning of the 11th of December 2008, FBI agents arrived at his apartment. One agent later recalled asking Madoff if there was any innocent explanation. Madoff answered simply that there was not. He was arrested and charged, and the news detonated across the world. The most trusted man on Wall Street, the former chairman of the Nasdaq, was the architect of the largest financial fraud in history. For thousands of families, the statements they were holding turned to worthless paper in their hands. There would be no trial. On the 12th of March 2009, Bernard Madoff stood in a Manhattan courtroom and pleaded guilty to 11 federal felonies: securities fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, perjury, and more. He admitted that he had never made the trades, that for years he had simply taken the money and printed the lies. The apology he offered to the victims sitting only feet away rang hollow in a room full of people whose lives he had quietly destroyed. On the 29th of June 2009, the judge, Denny Chin, delivered the sentence: 150 years in federal prison, the maximum the law allowed, along with a forfeiture order of $170 billion. The judge called the crime extraordinarily evil. 150 years was a symbolic number, far beyond any human lifespan. And that was the point, a statement that this was not an ordinary white-collar crime, but something closer to a betrayal of an entire society. At 71, Bernie Madoff was sent away to die behind bars. A man can be sentenced in an afternoon. The damage he leaves behind takes decades to measure, and some of it can never be repaired at all. First, the money. That $65 billion figure was the great illusion. It included decades of fake profits that never existed. The real wound was the principal, the actual cash that real people had handed over and lost. That came to roughly $17.5 billion, still one of the largest thefts in history. And behind that number were lives. Retirees who lost everything in a single phone call. Charities forced to close their doors overnight. The foundation of one Holocaust survivor and Nobel laureate was nearly wiped out entirely. As many as 37,000 victims in more than 130 countries were caught in the collapse. They were not all the wealthy stereotypes of Wall Street. They were teachers and widows and small family trusts who had been told by people they loved that this was the safe choice. Some lost their homes. Some, in despair, took their own lives. The fraud did not just erase numbers on a page. It reached into ordinary households on the far side of the planet and took everything. Then came the long, grinding work of getting it back. A court-appointed trustee named Irving Picard spent more than a decade clawing money back from those who had pulled out far more than they put in, and from the feeder funds that had fed the machine. The single largest recovery, more than $7 billion, came from the estate of one Madoff associate alone. Year after year, the trustee returned billions to the victims. Against all early expectations, by the mid-2020s, around 90% of the stolen principal had been recovered, an outcome almost no one believed possible on the day it collapsed. But some debts can never be repaid. The cruelest chapter of the Madoff story is what happened to his own family. His sons, who had turned him in, were never criminally charged, yet they were hounded by lawsuits, suspicion, and the unbearable weight of the name they carried. On the 11th of December 2010, exactly 2 years to the day after his father's arrest, Mark Madoff took his own life in his Manhattan apartment. His younger brother Andrew, who said the scandal had effectively killed his brother, died of cancer in 2014. Bernie Madoff himself died in federal prison in April of 2021 at the age of 82, still serving his 150-year sentence. Others answered for it too. Madoff's lieutenant cooperated with prosecutors and described the machine from the inside before his own death. The strip mall accountant pleaded guilty, and the Securities and Exchange Commission, humiliated by how completely it had failed, was forced to overhaul how it investigates tips, the very kind of tip Harry Markopolos had been handing it for years. The reforms were real, but they were written, as reforms so often are, in the ink of a disaster that should never have been allowed to happen. So what does Bernie Madoff leave us beyond the wreckage? A warning, written in letters so large we somehow keep failing to read them. Be suspicious of returns that are too smooth, too steady, too good, because real markets breathe, and anything that only ever goes up is hiding something. Be suspicious of reputation used as a substitute for proof, because the most dangerous frauds are run by the most trusted people. And remember that the watchdogs are human too, that a warning ignored is just as dangerous as a warning never given at all. We told ourselves Madoff was a once-in-a-century monster, a freak of nature we would surely never see again. And then, barely a decade later, a young man named Sam Bankman-Fried built a multi-billion-dollar crypto empire on the very same foundation. Dazzling returns, a brilliant reputation, and an army of smart people who did not want to look too closely. The world fell for it all over again. The names change, the math does not. Trust, it turns out, is the easiest thing in the world to counterfeit. Bernie Madoff stole money, but what he really stole was trust, the invisible thread that holds every market, every bank, and every promise together. If you have ever wondered how an entire economy can be brought to its knees by something you cannot see, then there is one more story you need to hear. How a single phone call and a mountain of debt that almost no one understood nearly ended the global financial system in 2008. That is next on the Money series. If this story held you, subscribe, and we will see you there.